Welcome to another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and this audio video is about a buck I took in Missouri in 2004 during their gun season, and I took it with a bow. Just in case traveling out of state is of interest to you, I'm going to give a short explanation of how I began hunting out of state and the process to do so. I quit gun hunting in 1991, and after several years of getting bored of just sitting around while my kids and friends kept deer hunting with a gun during gun season, in 1997 I decided to go out of state during Michigan's gun season, which runs from November 15th through the end of the month, to continue bow hunting in one of the well-known big buck Midwestern states. I certainly didn't want to replicate my home situation by going to a state to bow hunt during or after their gun season, and Ohio, Iowa, and Kansas were states that had their gun openers either in late November or early December. So I focused my attention on what I thought would be the best state of those three, which was Iowa. Iowa is a zoned draw state, and after some extensive research, the zone I chose was one where I would have a chance on getting drawn the first year I applied. So I applied and did get drawn during that first year. Fast forward a bit, I also drew tags for Iowa in 99, 2000, 2001, and 2003, and I took good bucks on every one of those hunts. While the number of permits remained static, by 2003 there were more than twice as many non-resident applicants in my zone as there were permits available, making the odds of getting drawn at best an every other year occurrence. The years I didn't get drawn, I received a preference point, which gave me preference of getting drawn the next year over the applicants with no preference points. Today, for the same zone that I applied in back then, it takes 3 preference points to get drawn because there's that many more non-residents applying. I knew in 2004 that I wouldn't get drawn for Iowa, so I signed up and paid for a preference point in Iowa, and stored preference points are good for any zone in that state if you choose to hunt a different zone than you originally applied for. Kansas is also a zoned draw state with a December gun opener, and after some extensive terrain feature research, the zone I chose for Kansas had fewer applicants than available permits, so I knew I would get drawn during that first year in 2004. After getting drawn for Kansas, I thought, what the hell? I'll also try to hunt Missouri on the way to Kansas. Non-residents can purchase a Missouri tag across the counter, so if my vacation timing didn't work out, I just wouldn't go to Missouri. I figured I could leave for Missouri on November 15th and hunt for a week and then head to Kansas to hunt the post rut through the remainder of November. Fast forward again, for several reasons, the post rut is now my favorite time of season for bow hunting in states with December openers. The process leading up to the Missouri hunt was nearly as gratifying as the hunt was itself. Because I was going directly from Missouri to Kansas, my focus was on several northwestern Missouri counties to keep the travel distance as short as possible. I purchased a Delorme map of Missouri to get a vague overview of the terrain, and my immediate focus is always on finding the counties with the most watersheds in the form of rivers and creeks. Once the crops in those areas are harvested, which they would be when I went out there, the brush and marsh grass lined tributaries oftentimes become the most secure transition zones as well as bedding areas. Keep in mind that this was well before Onyx and all of the current internet information existed. Once I was okay with the 3 counties that I chose, and they were all contingent, I called their county seats and ordered plat books. After asking, each county clerk told me that their county plat books would include each property owner's phone numbers, and back then, everyone had a landline. The Missouri gun season opens on the 2nd Saturday of November, which meant that if I went, I would be bow hunting more than a week into their gun season with my bow. Each of the 3 counties had public lands, and I knew they would be beat up by the time I got there due to the gun season. So as difficult as I thought it would be, I also wanted to try and get a couple free permission properties. County clerks are usually people who know most of the area's farmers and landowners, as they interact with them on a regular basis. Not being a shy person, when talking to each county clerk when ordering the plat books, I asked them if they knew any property owners that might grant permission to a serious bow hunter, and one of them did and gave me that person's number. Before receiving the plat book from that county, I called the landowner that she had given me, called him and asked for permission. And I mentioned I was from Michigan and was coming out to Missouri to bow hunt by myself in mid-November and was seeking hunting permission. He asked where I got his number, and I had no option but to tell him that the young lady at the county seat had given it to me. After kiddingly replying that he was going to have to talk to her about giving out his number, he replied, "You did say that you are coming alone, right?" To which I replied, "Yes." One thing I've learned over the years is that a property owner, when you're asking for loan permission, it kind of lends a sense of seriousness and dedication, and sometimes that can sway their answer. No property owners I've ever spoken to grant permission to several hunters coming out and intruding on their personal property, especially when you're asking for free permission. Your odds are always better going alone, and once you build a relationship, you may be able to bring a friend in the future. He told me that he had 3,000 acres and that his properties were spread out in 2 counties and ranged from 40 to 500 acres in size each. He asked when I wanted to hunt, and I said, hopefully after I fill my 2 Michigan buck tags, but more than likely I won't, so I would show up sometime around November 15th, which is the opener of the Michigan gun season, and I don't gun hunt. That's why I want to go someplace else. He said, "You do know our gun season opens this season on November 8th, and I replied, "Yes, I do know that." Then he asked why I wanted to bow hunt in Missouri during gun season instead of hunting in my home state during gun season. I knew that the way I phrased this answer might be an immediate deal breaker, so I chose my words as wisely as I could. I said that Missouri doesn't receive nearly the amount of deer hunting pressure that Michigan does, and the reason I quit gun hunting in Michigan was that I had a rifle bullet hit 10 inches over my head on a tree while I was sitting under it. And that was personally my cue to quit gun hunting. I have nothing against gun hunting, I just choose not to do it anymore. I also said that the bow hunting was more up close and personal and that I had been losing interest in gun hunting anyway. Lastly, I said, I've heard nothing but really good things about the size of the bucks you have out here in Missouri in comparison to what we have in Michigan. He was not a deer hunter and told me all of his properties got hunted by family and friends during both bow and gun season. I replied, okay, and before I could thank him for his time and hang up, he said, "I have a 40-acre parcel, however, that nobody ever wants to gun hunt because it's mostly nasty brush and bedding, and no matter where anybody sits on the property, they can't see over 50 yards. And most guys, when they're gun hunting with a high-power rifle, they want to have a pretty big visual. So this 40 acres, he said, just isn't that appealing to most of the gun hunters that contact me for gun permission." He said it holds deer and nobody has asked him to gun hunt it yet, so he told me that I could hunt that if I wanted. Then he shocked me by saying, "I'll tell you what, if anyone asks, I won't let them gun hunt it, and that way you'll have it to yourself from whenever you get there until you leave." And then he said, "Of course, I would like you to let me know when you leave and how you did." After giving me the location of the property, I thanked him. I Googled the 40 acres and pulled up an aerial of it. It was a square 40 and it looked to be a dense area of brush that was nearly 100% surrounded by crop fields on 3 sides and the road on another side. I also called the property owner directly across the road and received permission from him. He did not hunt either. And his property was only a few acres with a home and some outbuildings on it. There wasn't any place to hunt on that property when I got out there, but I did end up parking my minivan there because there was no place to park on the narrow dirt road and the hunting property had no driveway. I was fortunate to fill both of my Michigan tags, but it was well into the Missouri gun season when I filled my last Michigan tag. I hadn't booked a motel because I didn't know when I would be going, and the closest motel I could find at that late of a time that wasn't fully booked was nearly 30 miles away from where I was hunting. Since the property was on the way to the motel, I went there first on the trip and got there around 8:30 a.m. I always leave early enough where I know I'm going to get there pretty close to daylight so that I can scout and prepare locations on the first day. After meeting the property owner from across the road and him showing me where I could park, I crossed the road onto the property. It looked like an awesome area for deer to bed, chase, breed, and transition through, as there was dense brush interspersed with briars and some mature trees scattered throughout it. On a small piece like this, I typically walk the entire perimeter to see how the traffic flows in and out of it from the bordering properties. I then go back and enter the property down the runways that looked to have the best transition security cover for daytime movements and the most promising sign in the form of large tracks and tall rubs. Within the first 150 yards of entering the property, I spooked a buck that was bedded with a doe. I was sort of shocked when the doe ran off the property and ran over a quarter of a mile across a wide open picked cornfield to the north, with the buck only a few bounds behind her. I was surprised because I thought she would turn and go deeper into the dense security cover on the property. The buck was absolutely huge, one of the biggest bucks I've ever seen. He was really wide, and I was certainly glad it wasn't the opener of their gun season because they covered a lot of ground and went through a fence row before running out of sight. It was a weekday when I was there and well into the gun season, and I never heard a shot. The road ran north and south, and the hunting property was on the east side of the road. The property I parked on was the only home in either direction for over a mile, and I doubt it had more than 20 vehicles going down it a day. To the north of the 40 was the picked cornfield that the deer ran across, and it was at least 80 acres in size. To the east was a large field of tall weeds, and to the south was a 60-acre field of still standing corn. On the southeast corner, the property butted up to the northeast corner of a neighboring property consisting of mature timber with some dense understory. On the corner where the two properties met, there was about a 40-yard wide pinch point of excellent transition security cover joining the two properties and separating the tall wheat field to the east from the standing cornfield to the south. I set up 3 saddle locations. Number 1 was in the middle of the corner pinch point of timber that connected the two properties. Location number 2 was along the standing cornfield, and there were 3 runways that transitioned from the hunting property into the standing corn, and they were all within easy shooting distance. Location number 3 was near the east fence row in a large pine with a couple active scrapes under it. There were lots of rubs on the property, and all 3 of the trees I prepared had active scrapes either within shooting distance of them or under them. There had been a steady drizzle all day, and by the time I finished, I was soaked because I was wearing an old ScentLock suit that I used for scouting and preparing locations, and it was not waterproof. After checking in at the motel, I checked the weather forecast, and it called for drizzle and rain for the next several days, and when I woke up the next morning at 3:45 a.m., it was still raining. I was settled into my saddle a little over an hour before dawn in location number 3 for what would turn out to be 3 days of gut-wrenching all-day sits in the rain. By 11:45, I had seen a doe and 2 fawns and decided to move. Shortly before 1 p.m., I was settled into location number 2 along the corn and saw 3 small bucks transition off the property and into the standing corn before dark. I had to wash my Rivers West exterior garments in scent-free detergent and dry them, so when I got back to the motel, I asked the owner of the motel where the nearest laundromat was, and he told me he had everything I needed in the garage out back. In all of my 14 years of finishing drywall for federal subsidized living and staying in flea bag motels in just about every small town in Michigan, I had never stayed in a motel anything like this one. My $29 a night motel room had a full kitchenette, and there was a large garage with a washer and a dryer for customers to use. There was a ping pong table, a TV, and a place to hang, skin, and butcher deer. The motel was full of hunters, and every night was like a big social event as everyone either was deer hunting or trapping, and everybody seemed to know each other. The garage was their basically man cave. Everyone I spoke to was from Missouri, and this place was a hotbed for BS. Of course, they kept track of me every night when I returned because I was a northerner that they all thought was nuts for bow hunting during gun season and for sitting all day in the rain. They mostly just hung out in their garage all day because they didn't want to sit in the rain. One of the guys was actually running a trap line, and he was skinning coons every night during the BS sessions. It was fun BSing with them every night, but once my clothes were done, I was out of there, and by the time I was getting to bed each night, it was around 11 to 11:30 p.m. Concerning the weather, day 2 is a carbon copy of day 1, as it rained on and off all day. I chose location number 3 again near the tall weed field to the east, and it was a good call. At first light, a big half-rat came in and worked one of the scrapes. His left antler had busted off right at the base, leaving a big 5-point right side. He would have been a shooter had he had both sides. At 9 a.m., about 120 yards into the weed field, I saw what I thought was the wide-racked buck I bumped when scouting. He was diagonally crossing the field and wasn't coming closer on his own. Due to the tall weeds, he wouldn't have been able to see any deer at the base of my tree, so I tried to entice him in with a light sparring sequence. He immediately stopped, laid his ears back, and started coming in. As he closed the distance, it was clear he wasn't the big guy, but was a relatively wide 9-point. He jumped the fence and circled to the downwind side of the scrapes beneath my tree. Standing broadside at about 25 yards, I reluctantly passed on him. Had I not seen the wide buck the day I was scouting, I definitely would have taken this 9-point. I stayed in that tree the rest of the day and saw a couple does and fawns, but no bucks. As I had the previous night, I washed and dried my Rivers West exterior waterproof garments that I wore over my scent lock suit for the next day's hunt. It was still raining the next morning and the temperature was in the mid-30s. I hadn't sat in the pinch point yet, so that's where I went. The early morning was uneventful, but shortly before noon, I watched as the super wide antlered buck I saw when scouting chased a doe out of the weed field to my north and into the property. Odds were very high that they passed right by the tree I was in the day before. Talk about making the wrong decision. I sat and pondered on that the rest of the day. I considered moving back to that tree, but didn't, and the rest of the day remained wet and uneventful. I saw nothing else. When the alarm went off on day 4, I hit the 10-minute snooze button and went back to sleep. I'd woke up every morning at 3:45, hunted all day for 3 straight days in the cold rain, came back to the motel and washed and dried my exterior clothes each night, didn't get to bed until at least 11 to 11:30, and to say I was flat out worn out and had sleep deprivation would have been a major understatement. But that's hunting, and I didn't go to Missouri to rest and relax. So I sucked it up, and when the alarm went off again, I got out of bed, looked out the window, and of course it was still raining. The location along the standing corn was only a short distance down the fence row from the southeast corner pinch point location, and on day 4, I decided to sit along the standing corn. Although well before first light, once on stand and settled in, I could hear a buck chasing a doe in the standing corn, and the noise seemed to be at least 100 yards out. I would hear chasing for 30 seconds or so, then silence as he was likely breeding her, and then 10 minutes or so later, I would hear chasing again. All I could think was that this was the big guy and that he was with a hot estrus doe and had her pinned down in the standing corn to breed her. The short chasing and long stopping periods kept on going, and as they did, they just keep getting closer to the edge of the corn where I was at. As dawn broke and I struggled for a visual, they were close enough to see the tops of the stalks moving around when the chase periods ensued. About half an hour after daybreak, another chase ensued, and I could hear them nearing the edge of the field. Suddenly, the doe busted out of the corn about 40 yards west of me and stopped and turned and looked back towards the standing corn. She was on my weak side concerning hunting out of a saddle, so I swung 180 degrees around the tree on my ring of steps so that when the buck came out of the corn behind her, I would have a strong side shot. With her standing motionless, the noise in the corn was obviously of him in hot pursuit. Instead of him coming out right behind her as I suspected, and I had moved around the tree for, while still in the corn, he turned and ran east and then busted out of the corn to the east of the tree I was in. He never broke stride, and it became instantly obvious that he was attempting to circle around the tree I was in and push her back into the security of the standing corn. With my bow loaded and in hand, I swung back around the tree to my original position on the ring of steps. He was, in fact, the monster wide-antlered buck. I drew my bow, and at a little over 20 yards and broadside, I did a vocal domat to stop him and took the shot. My Carbon Express arrow flew true from my Matthews Conquest bow and entered just behind his left shoulder. It was a perfect double-lung shot, and I watched as the buck ran down the edge of the cornfield to the west and expired within sight. In all, I think he traveled probably 80 yards. I knew he was dead, so I hurriedly removed all my screw-in steps on my way down the tree. After laying all my gear on the ground below the tree, I walked along the edge of the standing corn towards the buck. You know how sometimes you get ground shrinkage? Well, this was not one of those times, and this buck was bigger than I had expected. He had a really wide spread and was a perfect 10-point with tall brow tines. Remember me saying how tired and worn out I was? Well, all of a sudden, it was like I just had a shot of adrenaline and I was on top of the world. Getting him out alone, I knew was going to be a chore. I carry a Versa cart in my minivan for just that purpose, and no matter how difficult getting a big buck out is by myself, I always end up getting them out. Sometimes it just takes a couple of hours longer by myself than it would if I had somebody helping me. And this was one of those times. After 4 days of rain, the bare dirt down the edge of the cornfield was now mud, and the 220-plus pound gutted buck made the skinny wheels on the cart sink very deep when I was pulling him down that edge. What a rewarding trip, and I was still going to Kansas, which was another perk. And this would be my first trip ever to Kansas. Once at the van, I tipped the buck over into an otter sled, and then I put the ramp on the back of my van, which my son John had built for me, and slid him up into the van. I then went back onto the property with my scouting backpack and pulled all the steps from the other two trees, and then went by and picked up the steps at the base of the tree I shot the buck from. Then I went to the motel and checked out, and on my way to Kansas, I called the property owner, who I had never really met. I just talked to him on the phone. But I called him to thank him and tell him about the buck. He was surprised I killed a buck during gun season, but he was also very congratulatory. He told me that I could come back anytime I wanted to bow hunt that 40 as long as I gave him prior notice well in advance. That hunt was in 2004, and after I called him again and he told me he sold that 40, I never did call him back to hunt any other properties, and I've never been back to Missouri. This was one of my more grueling hunts concerning sleep deprivation and just being miserable, sitting in drizzle and rain all day for 3 straight days and a 4th morning. But I will say this, at no point on any hunt was I ever wet. The Rivers West rain gear, in my opinion, is the best rain gear made, and I did not even get damp. The suit was drenched because it has a deeper napped exterior to mask the noise of the waterproof membrane, but I was not wet underneath. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If interested, the links to many of the podcasts I've been on, or for information about my 2-day whitetail workshops that take place in March and April, please visit my website at deer-john.net. Thank you for watching another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and to receive notifications for future videos, please subscribe.